Well, thank you everyone for being here today. My name is Brett, and I'm a reference librarian with New Britain Public Library. And we're really excited to be partnering with Concura again. And I'm thrilled today to be here in preparation for the Earth Day concert on Saturday, April 22nd. Wanted to begin by introducing kind of the moderator for today, Ellen Gilson Voth. Ellen is an active conductor and a published, regularly commissioned composer. She currently serves as artistic director of the Farmington Valley Chorale. Previously, she served as artistic director of Novi Cantori and conductor of the Pioneer Valley Symphony Chorus, as well as a music faculty at Western Connecticut State University, Westfield State University, Western New England University, Gordon College, and Ithaca College. And with that, Ellen, I'll hand it off to you.
Well, thank you so much. It is wonderful to be in this Zoom room with such an esteemed group of people. And I'll take a few moments to introduce to all of our viewers Chris Shepard, who is Concura's artistic director since 2015, also serves as music director of the Worcester Chorus in Worcester, Massachusetts, and the Masterworks Chorus of New Jersey. And his choirs have collaborated with a number of orchestras, such as Hartford Symphony, Juilliard, and also orchestra in Mexico. So we are thrilled that we can have this conversation with you, Chris, today. We're also very pleased to be joined by Geoff Hudson, who is the composer we're featuring in this upcoming performance on Earth Day. His music has been performed across the US and as well as in Europe. His 2019 Eco Oratorio, A Passion for the Planet, blends scientific prose, poetry, and sacred texts from many faiths, celebrating Earth's beauty, spotlighting global warming, and inspiring us to protect and preserve our home planet. So, Geoff, we are so pleased that you are on this call and we can get into your mind and process about bringing passion for the planet into reality. We're thrilled to be joined with Cynthia Jennings, who is a civil rights attorney and environmental activist. She served on Hartford City Council for 6 years and is working with the Connecticut Coalition of Environmental Justice. The coalition works to improve urban environmental health, primarily in Connecticut, through educating community, promoting changes in governmental policy, promoting individual, corporate, and governmental responsibility toward our environment. So we are so glad to have you, Cynthia.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I thought I would start our conversation with you, Geoff. And I have to say, before saying anything further, that I'm approaching this call from three lenses: the lens of being a conductor, a composer, and a singer for the upcoming concert. So I would love to get your perspective, Geoff, as a fellow composer, about how you were drawn to this topic of climate change, how you set the stage for yourself for the research and reading and study that you did that made this oratorio possible, and get us into your process and how your work and your study informed the composing along the way, and how you grew and your perspectives evolved in the process of writing.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. That's a huge question to start with. I began this project in 2017. I read something where a climate scientist said, we've been telling people about this for 40 years and nobody's really responding with the urgency that is required. And then he said, people aren't going to respond until they feel an emotional connection to the topic. The science isn't getting through. And that made a light bulb go on for me. As a composer, building emotional connections with the audience is what I do. And so I thought, aha, this is something that I can do to address this moment. And then I spent a long time trying to figure out what the words were going to be. And I think the first thing I knew was the arc of the piece, the general shape of the piece, that we would start in a place of gratitude, that we live in this amazing world, is part of this very complex and astonishing natural system. I wanted to start there and appreciate that. And then given the subject matter, I wanted to go into very dark places and look at what the climate crisis looks like. But I didn't want to leave the listeners there. And I wanted to find some genuine way out that doesn't say, here's the happy ending, but says, here's what we can do. And I found this wonderful quote from the naturalist David Orr, who said, hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. And for me, that was just really inspirational. And so I started working from there. I probably read 5,000 pages of scientific articles, poetry, things from different faith traditions to distill it down to about 3 pages of words that I ended up setting to music. I thought I was going to use a lot of poetry, and I ended up setting mostly scientific prose, which is odd. In the course of this project, I set words that I never thought I would set to music. They don't come to mind immediately, but there's some very odd words that are not found in the musical lexicon often. But I found that the science, the truth of what is happening to our climate is so horrifying that you don't need fancy words to have an emotional impact. What you need is for it to be heard. And we've all sort of numbed ourselves to the crisis. I think most of us know that this is a very serious situation, but we're very practiced at not looking at it. And I wanted the music to give people a safe space in which to open up and sit together and think about this and feel it. So I set mostly scientific words that don't leap off the page as things that you would set to music. And in fact, I think with music, they really connect with the listener. I set words like sludge, toxic sludge, and plastic, and I talk about plankton.
I'm thinking about this too, having just come off a recent project where I was weaving text from many different sources. And I'm curious, I want to take that idea a bit further, and then we can pull back. And Chris, I want to hear about your connection to this piece and how it's now connecting to Concora's season and the series at Asylum Hill. But when you have so many sources, there have to be some connective tissues musically. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about what holds this piece together. We have so many different voices that are all converging on the same potent subject. But for it to hold together for the singer and for the audience, that's our work as composers. And can you talk a little bit about some of the ways you approached that so that we hear this truly as a through composed oratorio?
That's an excellent question. One of the things that I mentioned already, the text "hope is a verb" with its sleeves rolled up, that doesn't appear until maybe 40 minutes into the oratorio. And for me, it's a central moment in the piece, and I wanted the listeners to hear it and feel it as such. So what I did was I tried to introduce that idea early. And in fact, the very first chords you hear from the orchestra are the music that will become "Hope is a Verb." Because by letting people hear it first, it sounds familiar when it finally unfolds. So that's one way that I did that. And there are several other elements where I either preview a theme before it actually comes out in its full way, or I offer an echo of it in the future. There's an instance where we sing in one really painful movement about the fact that because of environmental pollution, babies are born with toxins in their bloodstream. 200, the average American has 200 carcinogenic chemicals in their bloodstream at any given time. And in the next movement, which is very different, sort of a beautiful appreciation of the natural world, and the narrator is saying, I don't know why it's important that I share this with my grandchildren. And in the background in the orchestra, it echoes the "babies are born pre-polluted" line, just as a way to say, even as we're looking at the beauties of the natural world, that pain is still there. And for me, the full message of the piece, and it comes from starting with hope is a verb, with its sleeves rolled up, but also there's a wonderful line from Reinhold Niebuhr who says, nothing worth doing can be accomplished alone. And so for me, the whole piece leads to the end where the audience stands up and joins the singers on stage, and we all sing it together. So for me, the piece is a journey to togetherness. Nobody is going to solve this problem for us. We all have to do it together.
Well, thank you. It's great to get inside your brain as you laid the foundation, and now to be a part of this coming up here in just a few weeks. Chris, can you talk a bit about your encounter with the piece and how the partnerships then evolved?
Absolutely. Well, as a conductor yourself, and Jeff, you would know this, people are always sending you new scores. And of course, we have the composers that we like to work with. I've commissioned Ellen, for example. And so, although I love to find out about new pieces, so often I think, oh gosh, I've got sort of 2 or 3 years of programming sitting on my desk. How can I make room? Well, when I saw this piece, I immediately made room. And in fact, we were planning on doing this right when the pandemic hit. So this is one of those cabs in the rank that are finally taking off. I was sent a CD and a very short note by one of Concora's greatest supporters. In our 50 years, Judy Hyde has been one of the most generous supporters that we have ever had. And she has left Hartford. She's moved up to the Pioneer Valley. And she sent me the CD and said, I went to this concert at Smith College. It was absolutely packed. Everybody loved it. And then separately, I talked to one of our board members, Lori Chetto, who also lived down here. She taught at Hall High School in West Hartford, taught music, and is now in the area. And she had gone to it. So I listened to it. And I have to say, Jeff, I was just absolutely pulled in immediately. And part of what pulled me in was the opening, those opening brass, it's not entirely brass, but it's a brass choir color, which then becomes the hope is a verb. But it was so early in my journey, I had no idea. All I knew that it was this stentorian almost call to worship or call to action from the very beginning. So I fell in love with it. We decided to program it. We got some support. I should acknowledge them from Choral Arts New England, an organization that Ellen knows well. We got a grant, which then of course was put off till after the pandemic. But then things grew so organically from there. Jeff had so much to talk about in so little time that he didn't get to mention that the avatar of the future in this piece is a children's choir, for example. So I put together a children's choir, some from the Connecticut Children's Choir, but also from a couple different schools, kids from first grade to high school. I wanted this sense of the responsibility being handed over to the next generation to feel as inclusive as possible. So that was one collaboration. Then we returned to something that was maybe in my 8 years with Concora, the most rewarding experience that we've had. And that was when we performed Considering Matthew Shepard in memory of Matthew Shepard, the young gay man who was killed in Wyoming, this extraordinary new work with the Yukon Chamber Choir at Asylum Hill Congregational Church, because they have this extraordinary bequest that allows them each year to do a concert that is in support of another organization, because money was left to support this, so that the entry is by donation, which is just so generous. And it is music with a mission. So we went to Jack Pott, who's sung with Concora forever, who is music director, and he immediately said, please let us present this concert. This is exactly what that program is for. So I love that. That's such a value add for me when we can bring disparate parts of the Hartford area together, and to involve Cynthia's organization as well, which is so important, because hope is a verb. Hope is a verb. That's what I certainly take away from this experience. And so that at the end of all of this, if we aren't also doing something, then we're just consuming yet more. In this case, we're consuming music, but it's consumption that got us to this place. So it really is so exciting to be able to extend our arms out and enfold in all of these other organizations.
It's so wonderful the way the theme of collaboration is baked into this, from Jeff's score, which includes orchestra, choir, children's choir, soloists. You have all those different voices coming together. And then Chris, to your point about having children from many different ages and stages, but then also collaborating with the series at Asylum Hill and with local organizations. I mean, it's up to us as choral musicians to be embodying that collaborative, unifying spirit in a time that is so divisive and so polarizing, to be able to join arms and focus on something that is of such importance and such a pressing need for us to pay attention. Cynthia, I would love to hear more about your work with the Connecticut Coalition of Environmental Justice, and also the speaking about the current environmental crisis, but then also specifically about the impact recently on Hartford's inner city residents, and how you see your organization being able to connect to this concert with Concora and to this series at Asylum Hill Church.
Okay, and Ellen, I want to thank you for your insightful and probing introduction to Jeff and Chris, because I actually was raised by a concert pianist who was also a social activist and one of the first employees and one of the initiators of the Connecticut Coalition for, not a Connecticut Coalition, of the Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities, which is our statewide this anti-discrimination agency in the state of Connecticut. And it's been a unique experience. My mother would mask or cover or cope with all of her disabilities, which she had many from environmental issues. And she would cope with all of this with her music. And she passed this music on to more than 250 students, many of who see me today. And my mother's been gone for 8 years. And they say, oh, you look just like your mother. Oh, I mean, they talk about my mother constantly. But she was my inspiration to know that you have a right to legally redress your government, and you have a responsibility to protect the environment that you live in and the environment for those people who live around you. So she was an inspiration in my life. And so to know that a person who was so into music as she was, and a concert pianist, she performed in all kinds of venues. I mean, she performed in Newark, New Jersey at the Coliseum. I mean, my mother was well known, and she had her own music studio where everybody came to her when they wanted to bring forward a musical piece. So it's been a real inspiration. But I never knew that there was a group of individuals who were actually musicians that were so deeply involved in the environmental issues that are facing us. So that's my background, basically, in my history. I lived in Hartford, Connecticut, and Newark, New Jersey for a brief period of time. And in Hartford, I was faced with the fact that I lived near a landfill that was just offensive. I didn't realize it was dangerous, but I realized that it was offensive. And there was a woman on the street that was closest to the landfill by the name of Helen Nixon, and she started an organization called Survivors on Sunset Street. And when I met with Helen, I realized that the survivors on Sunset Street, that every Black man on Sunset Street had died from cancer, but two, and those two had cancer. It was an awakening moment for me. It was traumatic. I got PTSD as a result of that. I literally lost my mind, and I rolled up my sleeves and got busy to shut down the landfill, which ultimately we did shut it down. But not before we cleaned it up. The Justice Department came forward, and they really thought there was going to be a war in Hartford over this landfill. And we were really viciously fighting the landfill operators who had all kinds of leachate coming into our community. They wouldn't cover it up. They just would dump more garbage in, and not with no regard for the people who lived there. So it became a real issue of of exactly how we were going to move forward with this landfill and how we were going to actually save the rest of the people in this state. So in the city in particular and throughout the state of Connecticut. So it became CCEJ was evolved from Dr. Mark Mitchell and Sharon Lewis, who's now facing a horrible environmental issue of her own. And I'll talk about that later. And myself and a few others who really believed in fighting the environmental injustices that were facing North Hartford in particular. There was an organization called, a study was conducted by an organization called Toxic Waste and Race, which determined that you were more likely to live near an environmentally risky facility based on your race rather than your income. And for me, at the time, my mother, I always thought my mother was rich. I didn't realize we were middle income, but my mother had anything she wanted. And so we didn't see ourselves as poor. But my mother also was very clear that that you have a responsibility to everyone in your community, irrespective of what their condition is. So my mother, who was very much a person who would go door to door every Saturday, she would get me dressed and she'd give me my little bucket, and we would go to neighbors' houses. She would change their bandages, and it was my job to clean their kitchen and clean their bathroom and get them set up for the week. And so that's what we did every Saturday. So I just felt like you're supposed to take care of other people because they can't take care of themselves. They can't change their own bandages. And so, you know, we spent a lot of time doing that kind of work. So it was kind of ingrained in me to become an environmental activist, if not a leader. And so that's where we worked, and that's Connecticut Coalition for Environmental Justice. Under Dr. Mark Mitchell, he would train us incessantly. He would bring in medical students from UConn and other colleges and universities and make sure that they were going door to door with us to check out the health of the residents and to talk about the environmental risks that we were currently facing. And Dr. Mitchell would tell you, take out your calendars, and he'd say, okay, block off the 1st and the 14th of the month. And he said, because those are the only 2 days you have off. And he would work us. And so he would train us to go get in front of the cameras and actually talk about the issues. And it was just an amazing, amazing opportunity. Sharon Lewis came on. Dr. Mitchell was the first executive director of, Dr. Mark Mitchell was the first executive director of the Connecticut Coalition for Environmental Justice and one of the initiators. And Sharon Lewis came in as the second person that was in charge of the Connecticut Coalition for Environmental Justice. And she's been working incessantly, really very diligently. She's very brilliant, and she's been actually promoting the cause of environmental justice throughout Connecticut. So I think that's essentially how the Connecticut Coalition started. That's, you know, my background in history. And if you have any other things you'd like to ask, please focus me, because I'll be happy to answer them.
I'm so glad you're giving this whole background. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about how, from several angles, this issue is so enormous and so multifaceted. I think some people are stunned and think, what can I as one person do? And it's our job, whether it be from the podium or as a composer or performer, or, you know, in the field, working with environmental issues on a day-to-day basis, to help people be able to take the big picture, but then also break that down to some simple and concrete and specific things that I can do, choices I can make that impact my life, that can potentially have a ripple effect. And I think about that, Jeff, with the way you balance in the piece, the cosmic view, but also the specifics about a barrel of oil, for example, and then think, okay, well, what am I doing? You know, what are my patterns? What are my choices in my day-to-day actions? And how could I potentially think about what I'm driving, or how often I'm driving, or the like, to think, you know, bigger picture about such things. Chris, you looked like you wanted to say something.
I just was inspired. I just wanted to jump in for a second, because I would like to read one of the texts that Jeff chose that I think really pulls together both of what Cynthia and Jeff were saying. First, Jeff talking about that this is dense, in some senses, dense scientific prose, which really drew my attention. And I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but let me just say to all you baby composers out there, setting prose, setting words that don't rhyme is really hard. And this was how I first thought, oh, this is a composer who knows what he's doing. Because what it means is you don't really get to repeat phrases very much. There's no, the rhythm doesn't set itself up perfectly. But Cynthia, these words will resonate so much with you. The longest and most substantial movement in this piece is about 3 gyres. And yes, we had to look up how to pronounce that. And yes, we had to look up what it means. 3 gyres, and a gyre is a vortex or a swirl. And the most famous of the 3 gyres is this really quite disgusting. How could we have let this happen to our planet? This is quite extraordinary. It's known as the North Pacific Gyre, and it is just trash and chemical sludge that is the size of the 48 states of America, just out there in the ocean. I mean, how did we let that happen? That's just extraordinary. But the one that I want to read about, the second gyre, is the pollution over our head. But Cynthia, this will resonate for you. A third gyre of long-lived chemicals cycles through our blood and is stored permanently in our fatty tissues. They're in our air, water, food, and toys. And as Jeff said, babies are born pre-polluted. The average body now contains more than 200 chemicals that are thought or known to cause cancer and cell mutations, and to disrupt the endocrine system. So I think for so many of us in Concora, we just hadn't really come across a fact like that, which is a fact, Cynthia, that you deal with on a daily basis in your organization. And I'm so sorry to hear that in your own neighborhood growing up had happened. And we need to reckon with these things. People like me, I'm a native Vermonter. I love nature. I love the world. And yes, I believe in global warming, and I make some donations here and there. But until facing these texts that we are singing, you think, well, wait a minute. We all have to do something. We are so in deep in this. And what I love about this piece is that it doesn't take us off the hook. It says we are in deep. These things have happened. Our 4 parents have made this happen, but we have benefited from it as well. But then there's that turn that says hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. So it's a call to rolling those sleeves up. So if you love music, this concert is wonderful because it is terrific music. And Jeff, hats off to you. Honestly, you are an artisan and a craftsman and an artist. But to those of you who care about the environment, come join us. Even if you don't know much about choral music, hear these words. They're going to be up on screens so that you can follow the whole time and just get this new sense of action and bring along people who are curious about this. It's such an honor, really, but also a wake-up call for those of us who thought that we cared about the environment. And I think that means something different now.
I was going to say on this point, and Jeff does this so strategically, because he's setting a lot of prose. And to your point, Chris, the challenge of setting prose, it's not repeating itself, and you have to make those choices very strategically. He has a lot of unison and doubling and then homophonic sections. So the text comes through very clearly, but then when it needs to be repeated or treated as canon or imitative entrances to imply the fact that the costs reverberate from voice to voice and person to person and generation to generation, he's creating that as well. So one of the lines that stood out to me is, we are offloading the costs onto some later time. It's the idea that it's our job to take responsibility. We can't just put this off and the impact of this unfairly onto those who come.
Well, and quite literally, Ellen, you're right, and quite literally onto the littlest of those first graders who are singing with us. Like when we talk about future generation, we're talking about people who are on the planet themselves as well.
And the other thing too, back to the piece itself and the heaviness of the subject, but it's always this balance and I talk about this when I speak about composing, it's this consonance and dissonance seesaw. If music is too consonant, it seems too sterile, so too disconnected. If it's too dissonant, that can be too disorienting or too harsh to the listener's ears. And you're always balancing. And music history is ultimately this progression of our tolerance of dissonance, you could say in a nutshell. But every piece we're doing this. And I think you've captured that very well, because that intense line about offloading the costs onto some later time ends with a beautiful A major chord that resonates on the ah vowel. And in that space will be wonderful at Asylum Hill. So, we're getting into the meat, but then when we need to pull back and be surrounded by sonic beauty, we have that as listeners, that experience.
And I think the music is important as sort of an emotional solvent. We've read these things, we've heard these things said before, and until they really lodge home, you realize that babies are born already polluted with toxic chemicals. That's horrifying. That most of the oxygen we breathe comes from plankton. Global plankton populations have fallen 40% in the last 70 years. It's not an emergency yet, but that's not a good line to be on. And when you actually feel that, it's huge, and you need to get up and do something. And I just want to connect a little bit with what Cynthia said, and that with the landfill down the street. And there are these environmental sacrifice zones where pollutants are dumped, and all of the byproducts of our consuming lifestyle end up in these sacrifice zones. And it wouldn't be possible if we had climate justice. The climate crisis wouldn't be possible, because for our crazy burning of fossil fuels to continue, we need to have sacrifice zones. And so if we address the sacrifice zones, we also address climate change. And if we address climate change, we address the sacrifice zones. And that was the year in which I was looking for texts was one of the hardest years. It was, my wife would come home and says, "How was your day?" And I was like, ugh, I read a lot of really, really depressing things. And one thing that gave me a profound hope, and this was maybe 8 or 9 months into my year of reading, was these are not separate problems. It's not you need to solve this and then you need to solve this. They are the same problem. They are two parts of the same problem, and we can make progress on both by doing either. And I find that very exciting.
Mm-hmm. And you set up the piece to get people thinking in that direction, in the way you create that arc. I was going to say too, for our listeners who aren't familiar with this, and Jeff alluded to this before, this connects back to some action points. And Cynthia, I want to get your pulse on this. The piece begins with a celebration of Earth, and then it's moving into this sobering look about what is happening, and then to this call to responsibility and resolve. So it's intended to guide us as singers and listeners towards action. So, and how do we balance that, our need to celebrate the Earth with the heaviness of this forecast, this environmental forecast that we're looking at, and how we engage people in our communities with that balance, so they have a sense of the fact that my contribution might feel small to me, but ultimately can be channeled for a greater good. And I would love to hear your perspective on that, Cynthia, for people participating in the concert, but for people coming. What are some really practical action steps that they can take that would benefit your organization and your work?
Well, I think first of all that we have to celebrate Earth. Our Earth is so resilient that if we stopped doing what we're doing, it would ultimately clean itself up to a certain extent. So we have to recognize that we have to change the way we're engaging with our environment. We have to make sure that we are not polluting our water supply and putting these children at risk. We have to take a look at the children that are here now and the children that were here 30 years ago, and look at the difference in their health status. I have a granddaughter that is totally, she can't talk and she can't walk. She's now 9 years old, and she may never ever talk or walk in life the way they're predicting her illness. And so, and we have to recognize that the environmental risks that our children are taking are changing our children's DNA. They are taking our children and grandchildren away from us, and they are creating a real serious a serious void in our future if we don't address things now. So I think that it's important that we celebrate the earth as it is now and the earth's ability to recuperate and recover, and celebrate our own ability to recuperate and recover. And I think that that in terms of how we work on this, yes, it is everyone's responsibility. I am so glad that that Jeff brought this out, that Chris brought these issues out, because these issues are critical. We must address them. We have no choice, and they are the same problem. I used to ask people, how does polluted air know to stay in the hood? and that's a real issue. You know, polluted air does not know where the separations lie. So if you pollute in our neighborhood, it's going into your neighborhood and vice versa. So we have to recognize that now. And I don't know what else I could add to that, but I think that it's important that we do relate and understand these are the same issues, and it's how we address those ultimate issues that has to do with our future and the future of our children and grandchildren.
Mm-hmm.
If I could just jump in on your question about tangible things that you can do, there are all sorts of things that we can do as individuals. You can make choices in terms of transportation, you know, how much you're flying, diet. It's a complex problem. There isn't going to be one thing that solves it. You know, changing this solves a little bit, changing this solves another little bit. So all of those little bits count. A huge one that I'm excited about now is that there are 5 major U.S. banks that are funding most fossil fuel exploration and development throughout the world, and there's a movement to divest funds from them. And so if you have a credit card from one of those major banks, or you can move it to somewhere else, to a bank that is not doing that. And I sort of draw inspiration from the anti-apartheid movement of the 1980s. And I remember as a college student in those years, I was told, this is foolish, you know, this is not realistic. And then suddenly it was. And all of the big American businesses pulled out of South Africa, and it was not long before there was a regime change there. And I feel like the world of business is not set up to receive moral arguments. It's set up to receive financial arguments, spreadsheet-based arguments, things that you can put in a balance sheet. And if you take your money away from those organizations, they're going to notice that. And you don't have to get into the morality of whether it's okay to explore, to develop more fossil fuels when, if we burn them, the sea level is going to rise catastrophically. So that's another thing you can do. I think it's dangerous to think of this as an individual responsibility. We need to organize and get together in groups and push our elected officials to do something about it. There was Bill McKibben, who appears several times in the libretto, said last week, you know, the tools are out there. What we need to do is talk to big groups. We need to, you know, talk to individuals, but if you are part of a group, find ways to get more people involved. We just need things to happen more quickly.
Momentum. One question for you, and our minutes are flying here, but Cynthia, I'm thinking about how this concert is in Hartford. Of course, Concora performs in many different towns in Greater Hartford and beyond. But in every case, whatever town Concora is performing in wants to energize and empower that community. And for this concert being right there in Hartford in the Asylum Hill region, can you talk a bit more about the crisis in Hartford that you were alluding to, and how you and CCEJ are addressing it?
All right. Okay. So the crisis in Hartford is still one of environmental justice and environmental racism, and it is so it's so apparent in how much money is being spent in our communities to address issues such as the flooding in North Hartford, which has gone on, by the way, for 30 to 35 years. But we have had our water rates increased tremendously, and we are not receiving the same services that the surrounding towns are receiving. And that means that we're actually subsidizing the surrounding towns and actually subsidizing environmental injustice by paying our water bills, and not having those water bills, the monies that we're paying out, actually respent in our neighborhoods. So what CCEJ is an organization, and I think that Jeff is correct. You must speak to big organizations, and you must constantly speak to organizations and let them know what they can do. I fortunately was approached by, when I was an individual vigilante, I guess, in terms of trying to shut down the landfill in Hartford. And I was speaking to an organization that was in Boston. And they told me, they said, we will send you 2 full-time people paid by us to work with you for 2 years until you get this issue resolved. I never expected to have that kind of a response. And they literally supported us until we could get on our feet and do it, essentially ourselves. And after that, I mean, like maybe 10 or 15 years later, they put me on their board of directors, and it really made a difference in how I viewed how other environmental issues were being handled throughout the entire region. So I think it is important that we speak to big groups, that we do take our money away from people who are misspending or spending it. I mean, right now we're pushing for an investigation into how the monies are being spent in our water district, because if we don't do that, no one's going to do that. We're pushing for legislation. Right? Once again, he talked about the legislators. We're pushing for legislation with our legislators to pass a bill that requires an audit of how these monies are spent. And that bill is literally passed. It's in the Senate now, and hopefully it'll pass this session. And we started working on it 4 months ago. So people are so involved and so concerned about what's going on in our neighborhoods right now. And because we're speaking to organizations and groups, but also for one, when Sharon Lewis's house was she said her house got cold. She told her husband go down and click the button to put the furnace back on. He opened the door and there was water up to the 4th step. Her freezer was floating, with her mother's DNA in it. Her furnace was underwater, and her oil tank had broken off and was floating like the Titanic in her basement, spewing oil into the water. So therefore, the city of Hartford would not pump it out. The fire department couldn't come and pump it out because it was not water. So it had to be handled in a special way that cost $1 for every gallon of water that was processed, which came to $73,000. Nobody has that kind of money sitting aside to pay on, to invest in a flood in their basement. And that was just to pump the water out. So that's how expensive this flooding is. I had people who lost 2 cars. You look in their yard and their cars were covered up to the windshields with water. And so they lost 2 cars, their neighbors lost a car. So, I mean, we were, people, you have to share your story as well. Bridget Prince, who's a journalist and a filmmaker, is working with us, and literally she made it possible for the media to understand what's going on in North Hartford and what has been going on for so many years. So I think Jeff is right. You must talk to your elected officials. You must let those individuals who are elected understand that people elected you to take their side, not to take the side away from them. When I first started fighting over the landfill, I went to our city council, and our city council said, oh no, we signed a contract and an agreement with the landfill operator that we would never join with them in a suit against the landfill by the people in the city of Hartford. I said, oh, really? And then so I went to the Justice Department along with a friend of mine, Larry Charles, who since died who since died, I'll put it that way. And Larry literally had the Justice Department come in and investigate the city of Hartford on why you would say, why the city council would even think that it was okay to sign an agreement not to stand with the people that elected them to address these issues. So we literally had to fight the city council. And Ellen, you talked about the fact that I've been on Hartford City Council. Yes, I was, because I know how the council managed to stop that movement. And every single thing, including fracking waste, anything that when I got on council, I was on the chair of the Environment Committee. I held meetings with people from all over the state on fracking waste. I mean, they flooded our chambers on stopping the governor who was going to have allow a pipeline with a gas pipeline to be brought through our water reservoir. Oh, we fought that too and won that fight. And the governor actually lost his fight the next year. So yes, you do have to take on people that you literally might fear, and that are representing the power, but your spiritual support and the spirituality that you get from this kind of a concert, this kind of a commitment of people who have no reason to do something like this, but present something for our own uplifting is, it's something that is so needed and so required in this movement. So yes, thank you. There's a lot we can do, and everything that I could do, believe me, I did it, but I had to do it. And I had to also do it with people who were of like-mindedness about the lives, how important the lives in this community are.
Well, Cynthia, thank you so much. And as our time is finishing here, I want to highlight that this is a choral work. And this issue can permeate many different genres of music, but the fact that it is a choral work and that it is bringing together large groups of people, kind of the ultimate democratic enterprise in the arts, in the choral realm. And so I'm certainly hopeful that as many people watching this as possible are going to be able to come to see Chris conducting, to see Jeff's work in action, to support Cynthia and her work with CCEJ on Saturday, April 22 in the afternoon at Asylum Hill Congregational Church in Hartford. And all of those details will be on www.concora.org.